So good morning, everyone. We're going to start, try to keep to the schedule like yesterday. I'm not sure if the chair from the first panel is here, Luke. So if you're there, can you try just contact her to make sure, yeah, she joins us in the next short while. I did check with her yesterday and should be okay. Or maybe Melissa can do that. Is that okay, Melissa?
Yes, Hilton, that's fine.
Okay. Am I fine? Hey, you can hear me and I can start, okay?
Yes, loud and clear. You got it.
Okay, great. So I'm going to go ahead now. So welcome everybody for the second day of our conference. We hope it goes as smoothly as it did yesterday. So we had a wonderful marathon session of 10 hours yesterday with wonderful attendance, slowly picking up during the day, reaching close to 100 at times. So that's really great. I'm sure like yesterday, today starts a little bit slow and we're going to be joined by a lot of people. I anyway want to not repeat, but go over some of the formalities and thanks as Ariana did yesterday, because I know there's probably a number of people that weren't here yesterday for whom it would be important. So this conference, it's more than a year, it's close on 2 years in developing, and there's a lot of people we need to thank for that. Our funders, especially from the European Union of National Institutes for Culture, and in particular, Geraldine Rayamont, who worked with us from the beginning on this project, quietly and intensely at times. And we really appreciate the closeness with which they worked. And we hope we've been able to carry out at least some of what they had intended for the conference. Obviously, initially as a public forum in many ways, was of great concern to them. They wanted something to sort of reach out into the city and share with the general public, not only with academics. And that became more difficult when we sort of retreated in some ways online, although at the same time they'd opened it up very nicely to colleagues and interested people around the world. And we've had a great response in terms of that. So whilst we lost some of our local audience, we certainly gained an international audience, and we're well aware of them taking aspects of this conference out into the public. We hope at some point when things change again. I also want to thank my school, School of Architecture and Planning, our head, Namdi Ella, Patricia Turan, here, who's going to be chairing the first session, and Arielle Eisenberg, who assisted with the graphic work that you see in the poster and on the booklets that we shared. I also especially want to thank Melissa, who's here and who's going to talk to you briefly after me, from Bits Enterprise, who has been wonderful in organizing and managing this online conference, which is no easy task. And most of all, I want to thank my colleagues at History Workshop. That's Ariana, Noor, Ali, Luke, and Antoinette, for making this both intellectually and emotionally a fantastic journey over the last 2 years in developing the conference. They've been wonderful to work with, and we've had great and stimulating conversations over it. And from a personal point of view, it's for me important to kind of acknowledge my connection to History Workshop over the years. This goes back actually some 3 decades to when I first returned to the country in the early 90s and had this idea about doing an exhibition of architectural documentation or plans. And as an architect, I didn't know where to go. And somehow I ended up on Phil Bonner's doorstep at the Great Hall in the university. And he welcomed me in from the beginning. And so did so many people, Debbie Posel, Sue Parnell, and others in the History Workshop, for doing this kind of, even at that early stage, transdisciplinary work. So welcoming people from all disciplines into, I guess, their research, and also welcoming other ways of doing things. So not only the traditional papers, but also in my case, an exhibition. And I've continued to work with them up and down and over the years. And I just want to say how much I appreciate that openness. And it's an openness that I found extraordinary. And again, reiterate or found in this conference itself, this working across different disciplines, and as an architect, bringing so many different people into the built environment, something we often retreat to, but find so many others not only interested, but deeply aware of and wanting to work in, and recognizing buildings and cities as repositories of our history, and something that we all centrally want to grapple with. I just want to briefly go over some of the issues yesterday, which were so poignantly discussed by Ali in summarizing a lot of the talks yesterday. But just some things that came up that I thought would be interesting in pursuing today, and some terms that were not thrown about, but drew me in. So again, the continuous discussion between, and I think for architects or practitioners, this is really important, this discussion between the practical and theoretical is really interesting, coming up again and again across the papers. This notion of urgency versus the historical, so deeper time versus things that we just have to get done now, immediate, and things like buildings that exist over time or disappear over time. Another term that came up a lot, and I think is of importance, especially in this first session, is this notion of neglect, of what's left of the landscape and how much of it is actively engaged with, and how much of it is just left by the wayside. And as an opposition to that, the notion of revival or growth in terms of community, which I think again becomes interesting in this next session. Another point of discussion, which has also been important to me in addressing many of the spaces, buildings and places that somehow remain, is just why we even bother with them. And I think that's a more important question I still haven't seen well addressed, and that's why we still continue to rely on, as an architect, typologies like museums and monuments to address these historical issues, and why we're not expanding on it. It's something as a teacher I continuously engage with students in examining how far we can move from what we've been handed as ways of activating a landscape. And I think this was raised by a number of people from outside of architecture, why museums still? And it came in the discussion around the sense that many of the speakers yesterday had about the dying of museums, or especially under COVID, the pressure that museums have faced and how many of them seem to be barely surviving today. And it's a question not only of these as abandoned spaces, but these as spaces that maybe no longer have the same kind of functionality, or their functionality has to be addressed, and that we need to move maybe somewhere else. And I just raise this as an issue because it wasn't really answered yesterday. Saeed came again and was happy to. I was happy to see him again raised in terms of all the discussions around decolonization, its difference from the post-colonial, and his notion of a recoverable past is, I think, really important. What we would want and how we take it forward. Overall, there was this. In terms of finding ourselves thinking about or talking about the built environment or the landscape in South Africa, but what we're hoping to do is, broaden this conversation to Africa at large, is about finding a place in the world, how different people do it, how we've done it in the past, and how we might do it going forward. We see many of the same patterns in terms of interrogating these issues, but there were moments where I think issues or conversations came up that looked to move past it, how we move outside of our spatial, social, and political ways of doing things. And I felt overall that there was a call, especially as an architect, for us to look at where we go next, to new buildings, to other spaces, in order to answer some of these questions, not only of a deep past, but of a confrontation in our current environment. And Adema Davis raised the issue about the overall platform, which, as I mentioned early on, was really important to UNEC. And we intended, in terms of our engagement with Johannesburg Art Gallery and in terms of our engagement with the different European cultural spaces, to have broadened the discussion into those spaces, out into the city. And the online is a version of that, but I think it doesn't fully answer that. And we hope to pick this up at a time when we're able to move outside of the academic environment and back into the public. And in what ways we can do it. Exhibition is one way, but we're hoping these kind of discussions in a chaired sessions could be a way of doing that. And we will be addressing that when we go forward, past the publication, into other ways of raising these conversations that have started here, and we hope will go everywhere. So thank you, everyone, and we welcome you to today's session. We hope you with us most of the day, and look forward to talking with everybody. Melissa, I just want to call you again to maybe introduce yourself and let everybody know who you are, what you'll be doing, and what they can expect from you. And then we'll break just a few minutes and we'll start at 9 if Patricia's here.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much, Hilton. Hi, everybody. Welcome to day 2 of the In Whose Place conference. Again, we just want to thank everyone for their incredible participation. Thank you for your comments in the chat box, your questions to our different speakers. Just a reminder in terms of etiquette, if through the sessions, you could kindly keep yourselves muted and videos off. When we go into Q&A, the session chair will then, prompt you to then share your question, switch on your video if you like, and then off you go. If you experience any technical difficulties through the session, you're welcome to either direct message me or you can email me and I'll get on it and help you resolve it. If you've got any general conference inquiries, you're welcome to get in touch with my co-host Luke, who's been great, and will also get back to you so we can help you resolve and get the answers to you as quickly as possible. Just a reminder, these sessions are being recorded and we're also streaming on Facebook. So thank you, everyone. And Hilton, thank you again for this incredible opportunity. Back to you.
Okay, thanks, Melissa. Yeah, please note, please use the chat. It's been great to have alongside all the discussions going across yesterday. So I just want to call on Patricia if she's here. We managed to test earlier most of the, or all of the participants for the first panel, including myself. And so we're ready to go when you are, Patricia.
Yes, good morning. I'm here.
Good morning. Okay, so I hand it over to you now.
Thanks very much. Yes, so my name is Patricia Theron, and I'd like to welcome you all to the session this morning. We've got 4 presentations on the general theme of community building, and the session will be organized as follows, with the presentations running one after the other. This will leave us roughly 45 minutes at the end for discussion and to take questions. I'd like to invite you to post your questions at any stage during the presentations using the chat tool. It would be helpful for collation purposes if you could direct these questions to a particular participant by name. And yes, post these in the chat. We'll come back to these once we've heard from all the speakers. And during the discussion to follow, guests are welcome to use the raise hand function and to ask questions in a live format. In the presentations this morning, varied perspectives are adopted to an overarching theme of community building, involving the intersection between national political programs, the everyday, and the role of memory. Each of the contributions tells a spatial story of community, looking at community building typologies as civic infrastructures, the position that the built fabric of South Africa's teacher education colleges holds in the memory of communities, considering South African spatial histories in a context of erasure, uprooting, and relocation of peoples, and the transitory communities formed in the vertical navigation of Johannesburg through its lifts. Each of the presentations engages with the memories that persist in these places and spaces. Our speakers this morning are Ali Hlongwane of the University of Witwatersrand, Linda Chisholm, University of Johannesburg, Simon Gush and Bridget Kenny, University of the Witwatersrand, and Hilton Juden, also from the University of Witwatersrand. First up is Ali Hlongwane. Ali, are you ready to go? I see the time is 9 o'clock, so you have 20 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you. My presentation this morning has two parts, really. Part one revisits and re-engages the history of the struggles against forced removals by the people of Pageview, Fetus, in the western suburbs of Johannesburg. It explores this subject by reflecting on the photographic archive of David Goldblatt, assembled in the period 1965 to 2016. The second part of the article, which will not be presented today, but is part of the further development of the paper, reflects on the museum telling the story of Pageview, Fetus, drawing on the archives and oral testimonies from wider sources, but also including Goldblatt's photographs. In the process, I attempt to explore an ongoing theme that is currently occupying my research initiatives. That is the place of the unspectacular everyday in the public histories of forced removals. Pageview and Fetus stands today partly as a monument to victorious but ongoing struggles against forced removals, a legacy of resistance it shared with countless communities. Renowned South African artist Tami Miele, killed during one of many South African Defence Force cross-border raids on the liberation movement bases in Botswana, has among his surviving artworks a silk screen depicting armed police during a process of a forced removal. In silhouette, he depicts women carrying babies looking at their raised home with smoke billowing on the background. These images of victims and resistors of forced removals are depicted in the artwork with a bold and defiant message that reads, "In Nyanga, Kromdraai, Crossroads, Soekmekar, the people say no to forced removals." This rattling off of the names of various places by the artist whose medium imposes an economic use of imagery also applies to words and metaphors evoked by various poets, as demonstrated by an extract from a poem written by an unnamed Black consciousness movement activist and poet exiled in Botswana in the 1970s, who wrote, "The winter wind is cutting both my hands, the one carrying zanks to resettlement areas, Winterveld, Welcome Wood, Majaning, Groutville, the other with the burden of the toddlers to their graves, Dimbaza, Lime Hill, Ngutu." It is a history of resistance not only against dispossession and forced removals, but also against the imposed stratification of communities by the ideologues of apartheid along language and invented ethnic identities. However, Pageview, Fetus, partly in ruins, manifest in the outcropping of historic traces and partly home to resilient communities with a long history in the area, as well as new residents who are also part of the narrative of dashed hopes as the post-apartheid bureaucratic machinery stands still on questions of land restitution and restoration, save the recent re-emergence of empty rhetoric about addressing once and for all the historical injustice of conquest, dispossession, and forced removals. Pageview Fetus shares this legacy of dashed hopes and the lopsided redistribution of land with many communities, including District 6 in Cape Town, Marabastad in Pretoria, and Cato Minor in Durban. The histories, memories, and ruins of Pageview Fetus will be reflected upon, as I indicated, by revisiting the history of the community, as well as by deconstructing the visual archive of David Goldblatt, focusing specifically on the ruins and peoples of Pageview Fetus, representing the people between 1965 to 2016. David Goldblatt, who passed on 25 June 2018, aged 87, was born in Randfontein, the third son of Eli and Olga Goldblatt. He began taking pictures in his early school days, which appeared in the school magazine. When his father died in 1962, he sold the family business and explored opportunities of being a professional photographer. In one interview, he recalled that, I quote, "I became interested in photography in the late 1940s and began to look at magazines such as Life, Look, and Picture Post," close quote. Goldblatt told Colin Pantal, writing for BJP in 2013, I quote again, "In the early 1950s, I tried to become a magazine photographer. I sent my pictures to Picture Post and got rejected." In the same interview, he noted that it took him some time to probe, and I quote, "to probe until I could get to the underbelly of the society that underlay South Africa and to understand it visually. I also had to get a grasp on the history of the country," close quote. As a professional photographer, he made his way up through editorial photography, and by the 1970s had started to publish iconic photo books, giving a pin-sharp insight into his homeland, noted one of the authors of his obituary. The latter's archive has over the years been assembled in a number of published works in the vast material stored in the various archival deposits locally and internationally, as well as curated in sites like Fetus Museum Memory in Action, established by a resident of Pageview Fetus, Selma Patel. Before re-engaging the history of Pageview and reflecting on the selected photographic archive of David Goldblatt in relation to Pageview, it will suffice to reflect on the growing body of literature on the place of the photographic archive as a tool of struggle and a visual witness to the complex history of oppression in South Africa, as well as a source for reimagining the pasts of the complex history in the public histories of the post-1994 era. This is an era that has witnessed a memory boom, characteristic of peoples who have emerged from centuries of uprooting and disremembering. Goldblatt was a significant player in these memory-making processes as a photographer, as well as through his polemics of his place in this complex archive and memory boom. Photography has played a complex role in processes of dismembering and remembering. I have noted elsewhere the complex ways in which the photography of anthropologists imagined and disremembered their subjects. Ntongela Masilela, who has written extensively on the histories and cultural production of African intellectuals, noted Bob Gosani, Jugen Shaderbeck, David Goldblatt, the subject of my talk, Peter Makubane, Alf Kumalo, and a few others formed the first major school of South African photography. However, if, as Masilela has observed, there is the existence of a particular photographic tradition in South Africa, and that tradition was the photojournalism of the Drum magazine, Goldblatt operated not as part of this tradition, but simultaneously with it. It also suffices to point in passing that some from the Drum tradition transcended the photojournalistic mode. Consequently, Ntongela had the foresight to point out that the simultaneity of their existence within a particular moment will not be evaluated as critical as the very different reactions to the particularity of that period in their photographs. On the other hand, Newberry has pointed the close relationship between the development of photography and social and political issues in South Africa. The development of photography in South Africa over the years took place within the traditions of cultural resistance against settler colonialism. This makes the large body of photographic material available in the country and in the international archival centers a unique source of various memories of the liberation struggle and the everyday, though as still images of South African lives. This archive has also, as hinted above, in reference to the Fitas Museum, played an important role in articulating public histories of apartheid colonialism. The assumptions of some makers of public history are that photography has the ability to tell stories about the past. It also can capture a whole repertoire of human gestures to weave violence and love, damnation and deliverance, as well as exposing what we need to see and remember. Helena Pochland McCormick makes the following comment: as stories, they, that is photographs, become part of the discourse of liberation, or in the hands of apartheid spokesmen, part of the rhetoric of the necessity of suppression of threats to security of the state. As photographs, they become part of the inventory of the public history, or in the past, material evidence or documentation for government's investigations. Therefore, in engaging Goldblatt's images or records of witness, this reflection takes into account the fact that this medium can also be biased and selective, just as with an archive and memory. Richards writes that artistic license informs even photographs through selective cropping, captioning, framing, and focus. Further, the notion of art photography, poetry, theater, visual art, dance, film as weapons of struggle was constantly contested by diverse practitioners, including Mphahlele, Ndebele, Ntongela Masilela, Albie Sachs, to name but few, particularly where banal work was glorified as an aesthetic of struggle. Masilela further calls for caution that the politics of oppression that have reigned supreme for centuries in South Africa should not surpass the poetics of light, form, composition, and plasticity, which should be the arbiters in matters concerning photography. This debate has also found expression in scholarly writings on public history or heritage as the intersection of the dominant authorized narrative and visual representation, either marginalizing the vernacular that is the everyday or histories from below. In the context of photography, this debate, as I have pointed out somewhere else, has also taken on questioning the impact or lack thereof of iconic images. Mark Robbins, the former director of the International Center of Photography in New York, posited a view that the iconic quality can have a freezing effect and be a barrier to truly seeing that which is depicted. Goldblatt made his views known on the poetics of the creative forms of the imagination, to borrow Masilela's words. He has been referenced thus, been noted that David was very critical of people who made propaganda, and he would use that word.
We have 5 minutes remaining.
Okay, sure. Sian Klulu of Cape Town also makes the following view about Goldblatt. He tried to directly respond to the people he photographed and the complexity of what he saw. He was not just photographing the now. His images delivered nuance that frontline photography didn't. He wasn't shooting in that impactful way that would appeal to the hard left. What he was creating was very subtle, nuanced pictures. Part of his subtle, if not indirect, contestation of the notion of art as a weapon of struggle. He is on record expressing the view that he did not consider himself a journalist or a polemical photographer, and further opened that I can't claim to be a revolutionary, and I don't like calling myself an artist. I am a craftsman of photography. In his search for a nuanced aesthetic, it has been noted that virtually all of his work was done in black and white because, as he said, color seemed too sweet a medium to express the anger, disgust, and fear that apartheid inspired. In interesting practical ways, he demonstrated through his ideas and photographs the quest for ways to question hegemonies of power. A contradiction emerges in the description of Fetus as a suburb of one definable section of South African society. Does Goldblatt's photograph disrupt these imposed identities? We will find out along the way. Several photographs beginning around 1965, stretching beyond the 70s to about 2016, are of people's homes now empty and deserted, but the architecture, colorful walls, and surviving signage on the walls are a constant reminder that people lived there. Aerial images showing graveyards as well as railway yards are the physical reminders. The physical landscape is softened by the images of innocent, buoyant children across the color line, playing and somehow posing for the photographer. The backyards reflecting how families lived, reflected in the mundane but telling images of toothbrushes, Colgate, and the mirror, as well as images reflecting how some made a living as backyard mechanics and the ever-presence of washerwomen. Colorful shop verandas that are always remembered as one of the defining characters of Fetus, with wares displayed on windows, shoppers passing by but frozen by the camera, with clear, sometimes faint distinctions of who was the worker, the security guard, the proud child, or the shop owner. Children proudly posing in their decorated bedrooms, playgrounds, and in religious garb, and in other instances, school uniforms. The many instances in which children had to spend the whole day, weeks, months, and years next to a parent, always a woman, selling cooked meals from a brazier that is part of her stall. Young couples with newly born, with their worldly possession crammed, but projecting from the background with a sense of decor and dignity. The old pondering the future with bottles of medication reminding us of the years lived and journeys traveled, which meant nothing to those with the gun and the power to send bulldozers. If resistance is the dialectical opposite of domination, as the Pan-Africanist scholar and activist Tony Campbell pointed out, defiance and social action that characterized experiences of dispossession and forced removals in South Africa in general are missing, in fact, absent in Goldblatt's imaged Fetus. His historical imagination does not overtly locate even pockets of resistance, so well pronounced in historical in oral histories of the residents of Pageview and Fetus. This is probably a reflection of his positionality that I don't often report on or photograph events. Just a quick closing remarks as I have run out of time. In these reflections on the visual imagination of Goldblatt, I have noted the movement, progression, and intersection of the practice of documentation and artistic expressiveness, despite his protestation that he did not define himself as an artist, but a craftsman. He was not content with conveying the inhumanity of apartheid colonialism. He consistently strove to relate the will to live of his subjects. The landscape of Pageview Fetus is examined in its complex form in a society that was obsessed with dividing people. He depicted the innocence of childhood, reciprocal relations of dependency between residents and the shopkeepers, and the tragic experiences of uprooting in the gaping wounds of the ruins of Pageview. The part demise of apartheid colonialism and its stubborn legacy does not cast a shadow in the reading of these works and appreciating their strengths in their cosmopolitan structure, the movement and projection of light in them, as well as the orchestration of the black and white photographic medium as opposed to color images. These aesthetic devices he explored theoretically in many of his published work. In the body of this essay, an observation was made on the silences of Goldblatt's photographic narrative of Pageview, on the theatrical expression of the arrogance of the repressive authority. This, rather than being a major fault line of his visual imagination, can also call upon the reading of his work alongside those of his contemporaries to reflect on the depth of the different reactions to the particularity of the period in the photographs of this essay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ali. And next up we have Linda Chisholm. I have the time as 9:23, so you've got 20 minutes.
Myself. Okay. Okay, as let me. Okay, as institutions that were intimately and profoundly implicated in the colonial production of racialized and gendered subject identities, teacher education colleges are indeed monuments that have fallen. They dominated the teacher education landscape as segregated institutions for close on a century, reaching by 1994 to 95 more than 120 institutions. And they fell in 1999, being chipped away at from the late 1980s. Several of the larger urban-based colleges were absorbed into universities or technikons, as at Wits, Durban, Cape Town, and Pretoria, for example. About a quarter of them were converted into what were called further education and training colleges, providing technical and vocational education and training. And the remainder were converted into high schools, community colleges, and provincial training centers. So, for example, the Graaf Reinet, this was a white college, although the majority were African, and I'll show some of those too. I'll talk about those too. But so, for example, the Graaf Reinet Teacher Training College, which represents the grandeur of the colonial vision at that time, when its function became absorbed into the Nelson Mandela Metropolitan University in the 1980s, the building was repurposed first to become an FET college, and it is now a police college. By the end of the 1990s, teacher education colleges had been reduced from some 120 to 25 contact colleges and 2 distant colleges. Almost immediately, there were calls for their reopening, and a certain nostalgic view emerged. The idea emerged and was promoted, and is still often promoted, that they served rural communities, provided a more practical training than universities, they were more affordable, and they provided for communities that universities do not, for a sense of community that universities do not. I've been intrigued by this nostalgia for quite some time. Firstly, because it is seldom associated with the actual physical buildings, and yet the call for their restitution is for colleges as physical entities to be built. And secondly, I'm intrigued by them because the nostalgia reaches across white and black, even though they were highly racialized institutions, deeply rooted in the supremacist social engineering of apartheid, and even though there is evidence of deeply ambivalent experiences within them. The repression of the 1960s and 70s, for example, combined with more politicized experiences. There are many different ways to understand this nostalgia, and I started off in 1910 working with Jacob Dlamini's work on native nostalgia and Cheryl Walker's on land, to argue that the call for reopening colleges could be understood as a romanticizing of the past in which what was longed for, but that could never be reconstituted, was the relationships that were forged in them. This is the argument strongly in Cheryl Walker on land restitution, but also in Jacob Dlamini's work. So it wasn't so much the physical dimension, but rather aspects of the inner and social life of the institutions wrapped up in the physical space that is recalled. In my next effort, my book on the history of teacher preparation in South Africa, which is a sort of entangled, interconnected study of the long history of the emergence of teacher education colleges and their relationships with universities, the burden of the argument is really to show that the history of colleges is a long history with generations of people having gone through them, and they were imprinted in memory and on the landscape in specific ways, but very much so in a racially segregated way. So let me just say something about this. African teachers were trained as teachers in and by mission schools until the 1950s, while colored and white teachers were prepared in standalone colleges from the beginning of the 20th century. The gradual segregation of colored and African aspirant teachers from whites in the Cape Town College of Education occurred at the turn of the 20th century, and the segregation of African from colored started happening after 1910. But mainly African teacher training persisted in the mission schools as training in an extra grade. But from this period, from 1910 onwards, the number of colleges specifically for whites grew enormously. And it was only during the apartheid period that, as we know, they grew exponentially for African teachers within the Bantustans and within the framework of them. Now, I was intrigued, I've also been intrigued by the buildings, which the mission institutions, for example, all of them in different ways, whether they were the mission schools or the white colleges, the standalone colleges, they really do represent the grandeur of the colonial image and the colonial vision of the role of education. Although they also, as buildings do, change significantly. So this one static image doesn't represent what Lovedale was and became over time as there were additions and so on. Similarly, with the Lutheran mission in Natal, the buildings changed, additions were made, and it altered over time. Similarly, too, with the Inanda Seminary of the American Board Mission of the Congregationalists. I'm just trying to give here just a sense of the changing styles and the different styles This was the Humano Seminary for Girls in Wellington that Sarah Duff has written quite a bit about, and very typical of the grand teacher education college called the Norman College that emerged as the dominant form, highly feminized at the turn of the 20th century for whites. Here is a picture of the Pretoria Normal College. It's actually a postcard from 2016 or 2011. I can't quite make that out. And similarly with the Normaal Opleiding College in Bloemfontein. Anyway, what they were called shifted over time and over the century. They were variously called the normal colleges, training schools, training centers, training institutions, and finally, from the 1980s, they were called colleges of education. One of the arguments in my book is that the relationship with universities was not a new one. So this argument that they needed to be reconstituted, that the university training was somehow foreign, was historically misplaced, because even when one considers the training of primary school teachers, the link with universities actually existed from the beginning of the 20th century, where WITS was the model. Universities provided the academic education of teachers, whereas the college provided the professional preparation. Of course, in the case for whites, matric was the qualification for entering into teacher training, whereas it was up until the 1950s, standard 8 for African and colored teachers. And so the link with the universities was at first predominantly one that was isolated to the white universities. But Wits was the pioneer of this model in the 1920s. The Giyani College of Education, which was a black college founded in the aftermath of 1976 in Bantustan, and very typical of the buildings that were built most often as prestige projects for Bantustan leaders. Now it's no longer used as an education college, and there are calls for it to be reopened as a college, or if not a college, then a university. But this one also developed a close relationship with WITS. Now, what I suggest in the book is that the absorption of colleges into universities was a logical outcome of both deeper historical and conjunctural trends. Firstly, the movement in both black and white colleges towards greater cooperation with universities was in tune with similar global trends with which South African teacher education policymakers right throughout the apartheid period even were closely in tune. And secondly, the debate about whether universities or colleges were the most appropriate place for the training of teachers was a recurring one throughout the 20th century and was resolved in the 1990s in favor of universities in the context of neoliberal cost cutting and belt tightening. And fourthly, because university people, I think, dominated policy-making processes for colleges and were extremely critical of both earlier provincial and Bantustan control and the quality of what happened in most black colleges. So they overpowered the much weaker college lobbying groups that did not call for a blanket closure, but for a more differentiated approach towards them. In the maelstrom of transition, where the old provinces and the Bantustans disappeared, their stranglehold over teacher education also evaporated. So control was either then to be transferred to the new provinces or to the national department. The new provinces were not yet in existence. They were hardly established, and so they fell to the national department. Whatever the dynamics of the closure, it was a traumatic rupture for the sector, evoking this nostalgia and the call for their reopening. And they also ended a very long history, both physically and symbolically, that had imprinted itself both in memory and on the landscape. In the paper that I did for this conference, that has now actually already been published, I wrote about landscapes of teacher education in South Africa. And here I drew on Lefebvre's notions of time and space as social relations, on Komarov and Komarov's study on the formal and informal messages of institutions like mission schools, and Gillian Hart's work on relational comparison to explore the physical and symbolic dimensions in greater depth. And I argue in that paper that I would have presented here, but I'm now putting it in a slightly different context, that although they may have departed the physical landscape, they remain as teaching and learning spatial imaginaries, I'll come back to that a little later, and as landscapes of memory and identity. Now, I found Anne Stoler's work enables a different and possibly a richer interpretation. She's interested less in the physical remains than of the people living in them, less in the melancholic gaze than in what she calls the trail of the psyche. And so she makes a plea in this book, Duress, for histories that go beyond rupture and continuity and that take on recursive analytics. In this recursive analytics, she wants attention paid to language, what she calls amplified reinscriptions, retranscriptions, and recuperations that collapse temporalities, such as that between the colonial present and the colonial presence. She's interested in a past that is imagined to be over, but persists, reactivates, and recurs in transfigured form. What we need to do, therefore, is attend to what she says, what she calls reappropriations, strategic neglect, and active positioning within the politics of the present. And I just want to end my presentation with a little bit about that, specifically on these strategic neglect and reappropriations and active repositionings within the politics of the present. Teacher education colleges no longer exist. Their original physical forms have long been repurposed, reconfigured, recast. But strategic neglect of history of teacher education within teacher education today creates not only nostalgia, but also the presentation of old ideas and practices as new. So, for example, a central component of missionary schools' teacher provision, as much as of normal colleges and later colleges of education, was the teacher practice school. The teaching practice school. It was a school within which, or was associated with, or attached to the college, within which model lessons were presented and teaching was practiced. And while teachers were being trained as pupil teachers within a school, in the mission school, for example, the practice school was the school itself. As teacher preparation moved into a separate building, the normal college, the practice school was often nearby. In 1920, Albert Luthuli received a government bursary to attend a higher teachers training course at Adams College. He subsequently joined the training college staff. And although he's now better known for being a teacher of Zulu as a language and the history of and Zulu history, he was also the supervisor of the practice school. As numbers of students expanded over time in colleges, the numbers of schools allocated for practice teaching also expanded. As universities gradually extended their reach over teacher preparation in the second half of the 20th century, the idea that teacher preparation, very popular in the UK, the idea that teacher preparation should occur in schools gained ground, but in South Africa that never got much traction. South Africa resisted that particular trend. But as the numbers expanded, the practice school tended to disappear, or many practice schools were attached to those universities who could provide practice teaching. But in 2011, South Africa officially endorsed the idea of teaching schools or practice schools and professional practice schools. Research began to be conducted into its desirability and modalities. The University of Johannesburg has now pioneered such teaching schools. It differs from earlier models in that it now involves not just the college staff and students, but is a hybrid, including school teachers, teacher trainees, and university staff. And it is a concept, however, that is a very old one. So Wesley Teacher Training College, which was founded in 2011, thereabouts, in Cape Town for colour teachers. The Wesley Practicing School is recreated on its website in a history that it describes as follows. The inclusion of the word practicing in the school's name has raised many questions, and then they go on to describe that. But the point that I want to make simply is that the past appears in reconfigured form, but all traces of the memory of its origins are commonly wiped out, except here, which is quite unusual. The post-colonial thus presents itself as rupture and discontinuity, but remains deeply implicated and shaped by it. As Tariq Tofa said yesterday, the past is deeply linked and interlaced with the present.
We have
Thanks.
5 more minutes.
I'm finished.
Come to the end. Okay, great. Thank you very much. And we can move on to the next presentation, which will be by Simon Gush and Bridget Kenny.
Mute.
Hi, can you hear me, everyone?
Yes.
We are trying to do the audio off of Simon, so it's maybe confusing. Okay.
Let me play. Is it playing? Yeah.
Okay, you can see our slides, right?
Yes, we can, and it's 9:41, and you've 20 minutes.
Great, thanks so much, everyone. Thanks for having us. We're excited to be here. We are going to talk about a project that we're working on, and this paper is called Lifts and the Labor of Repair. This is a project that we're in the middle of working on. And this part of the project comes out of a larger project of mine where I examine lifts as an intimate public space. I won't talk about that so much in this paper, but there's a larger project there where I'm looking at lifts from a range of different angles. Simon and I met, in fact, based on my first book, which examined retail workers' politics over nearly a century in Johannesburg. And he did a number of the photographs for the book, including the cover photograph. So I went from studying retail workers' politics in retail arenas to studying department stores, which is another project I have, which thinks about department stores as public intimate spaces in Johannesburg and also in comparison with Baltimore, Maryland. And then from there, I moved to lifts. So you can maybe kind of see those connections. But today, what we're going to be doing is thinking through the lift as similar to many of the papers that we've seen in the conference as an infrastructure that's both a kind of a metaphorical infrastructure, but also quite a material, concrete infrastructure that helps to explain cities. And of course, with lifts, the technology is very important, the technology to carry people up. But the critical technology for that needed to be invented with elevators was the technology to actually stop them from falling. So lifts, quite famously, the safety mechanism was invented by Elijah Grave Otis and was displayed in 1854 at the exhibition of the Industry of All Nations in New York, where he let the platform upon which he was standing 50 feet up fall, and his safety device stopped the platform. That is then a critical technology, along with the steel frame that explains the emergence of the skyscraper, as Rem Koolhaas's study, sort of classic study of skyscrapers outlined for us. And thus we are able to then think through the technology, the developing technology of the elevator, also in relation to tropes and thematics of modernity. You have both the emergence of tall buildings, and this includes in Johannesburg, elevators being used in buildings, from the turn of the century. But by the 1930s, they're importing lifts, multiple banks of lifts for buildings. And here's a quote from 1930. From a newspaper article saying the technology compared more than favorably with any elevator equipment in any part of the world. They are adequate monuments to South Africa's architectural genius and to the proficiency of her workmen. Lifts that therefore substantiated buildings, both structurally and aesthetically, in article after article, we see how the lifts stand in as symbol of the modernity of the building. So it's the lift's high-speed gears, it's their full collective automatic control that's available technologically, even when not used, because as we'll see, the attendant is very important in a settler colonial context, but it's also the aesthetic internal of the polished brown mahogany, the special mirrors, the unique lighting, and the bronze safety gates that get featured over and over in the discussion of these lifts. As I say, the technology is available for automatic lift operation, but the lift attendant is necessary. And I've written elsewhere on lift attendants. In the late 1950s, lift operator jobs for passenger lifts are one of the first job reservations that go through when the Industrial Conciliation Amendment Act goes into effect. Basically, you have in the discussions in the debate, it is and this is the language they use, it is the infirm white liftman who must be protected by the National Party at the time, and their jobs are protected. So it's a gendered notion, of course, of the liftman who is driving the lift, but none of the employers or building owners particularly want to keep these guys on employment. They would prefer to hire Black men. In department stores, white women, of course, are hired. And some of you may be familiar with the Jeremy Taylor song, Lift Girls Lament. And I write elsewhere about the lift girl in department stores operating the lift and the class and gendered components to that. Therefore, there's the idea of the technology and the operation of lift includes this affective order of racialized control in the everyday spaces of urban change, in particular in Johannesburg at that time, as migration shifted the profile of the city. But what we see then is also the history of self-service of lifts, which is, how we today think through what a lift is and what our experience with lifts are, itself is imbricated into this history, which tracks the city's racialized labor regimes. So that after 1977, the job reservation is canceled, and partly canceled, because of the labor movement, but also canceled because by then the technology has moved on. New buildings are installing automatic lifts automatically. Older buildings are moving over to, switching over to that technology. So today, the operation and the control of that, of the movement of those lifts are controlled by elevator banking and, of course, algorithms, which track the up and down course of lifts. Some of you can know, in some lifts you program, ahead of time which floor you want to get into, and then you walk into a lift and there's no buttons on the inside, because those algorithms are controlling which lifts you can step into. So the ideas of these pasts and presents then trace Johannesburg's modernity through the route of the lift. And similar to many papers, and I think Linda's way of framing it at the end of her papers is an incredibly sort of articulate way of saying what we're trying to also get at, and what I think Pamela's paper was also trying to get at, is in these what could be imagined as ruins of these infrastructures. As any of us know who've been in or live in or inhabit these buildings, you wait over time constantly, for the lifts to work. You may wait at the bottom and you wonder whether these lifts are working. But part of what we're considering then in that imaginary is in fact the continuous and enduring labor of repair and maintenance required to keep lifts functioning. So we kind of move from the way in which lifts become a kind of metonymy of the modernity of the city. In other words, the lifts themselves track those histories, but track them for buildings and track them for other sets of relations. And yet we're also sort of trying to think through how there is this continuous and enduring labor attached to it. The final point I'll make before turning to Simon, who talked more about the labor, is the way in which the lift has multiple geographies that we're very interested in. So we have the lift joining the street to the interior of the building, the elevation of, the lift goes up, the elevation of that lift joins the ground to the sky, as Stephen Graham's work and this, sort of calling for an understanding of a three-dimensional city, or the kind of verticality of urban space, not just the horizontality of it. We have as well the connection of public and private. We have work and home, as we'll see with Simon's comments. We have the interiority and the intimacy itself of the cab or the lift car, and all of that kind of awkward relationality that happens in a lift car. We have lifts as sites over time of disagreements of property and residence. We have the geography of lifts as they themselves map the city, and this is no more the case than the sort of beautiful understanding of our old lifts in the city of Johannesburg, right? I mean, many of the lifts have been there for 50 years, and they have been repaired and they have been refurbished, but they're the same lifts. And the way, a company who services and repairs lifts gets a contract for a stable of lifts, and they move around the city fixing the same lifts over and over again, or repairing or maintaining them. And that itself offers a kind of different geography to the rhythm of the city. And then finally, what we're interested in then is the actual labor that keeps those processes going. And I'll turn over to Simon.
Okay, thanks. So I think when when Bridget invited me, I really approached this. I mean, I always kind of find a kind of personal experience or way in. So I really started thinking about the lift in my own building, and it's a very kind of old, precarious lift that always breaks down. In fact, at the moment, it's currently broken. I had to walk down 16 flights of stairs to come here to present with Bridget this morning, and have been walking up and down all week. But I think there's an image that really helped me start to think about this. And it's on the 16th floor where I live, there's a small drawing of a house that's been scratched into the wood panel next to the lift. The drawing is quite sort of childlike in the way it's been executed. It sort of very much uses the symbols that children use to draw a house. It's a double-story house on its side. And I think it kind of really is a way for me to think about the way that lifts allow for a certain way of living. They operate as the space between home and work, as the kind of actual physical link between these spaces. And I think that, I think we both have an interest in work and labor, and slightly different takes on it. I think where Bridget's more kind of keeps working the idea of kind of wage work and as this kind of key point in the labor relation. I'm very interested in thinking of a kind of expansive idea of work and sort of working against capitalist definitions of work, which really are centered around wage labor. So the lift for me in its verticality, I think, is a way to think about an actual link between home and work, between spaces of reproductive labor and productive labor, or to think of those things together as opposed to use those kinds of ways of distinguishing forms of work. So, the home is this kind of site of reproductive labor, of unpaid labor, the work that sustains work in a sense, or the ideas of work around this one. And you really see this in these old buildings with these old lifts. You see, like, for instance, I'm often riding in the lift with someone who works in the informal market downstairs with the boxes that are coming up, where homes are used as storerooms for products that are being sold, like shoes and clothes. There's a woman in my building who every morning takes down the sweets and the loose cigarettes that she sells at a little stall opposite the building entrance, She goes down every morning. When she needs the toilet, she uses the lift to go up to her apartment to use her bathroom. Sometimes her colleagues as well on the market use that bathroom. At the end of the day, she takes it up. So there's this way in which the lift constantly is moving between these spaces. And there's a way to really think, I think, through its verticality about how these spaces are kind of inseparable. So instead of thinking in these categories of reproductive labor as separate, it really is the actual site where these spaces become linked. And I think it's really important to think about these spaces together, because I think it's a more accurate description for me, I think, at least of what constitutes work, to be able to think reproductive labor with productive labor, to think about both what that does in terms of how it changes our definition of work, expands the definition of work, but also how it denaturalizes the idea of care or reproductive labor. So it's able to, I think, affect the way that we think about both of those concepts. I think that there's also another aspect of work that really speaks to, that is a kind of horizontal network of labor that goes into lifts. And this really works in the repair of lifts, so the actual labor that keeps the lifts going, so the repair and maintenance. And particularly with old lifts, there are certain forms of labor that are kind of implicated into it. So with old lifts, you could be, and most of the time what happens is a part breaks, or a part gets worn out and has to be replaced. And there are different ways in which you can deal with this, and that require different kinds of work, and also kind of implicate different supply chains into this labor. So the first is if you're lucky, the part could be replaced with a new part. New parts, new lifts are almost exclusively built in China. This means that a part will be ordered from a factory that's produced by Chinese workers. It would be shipped across to South Africa. It comes through the ports. It comes into the storeroom. It would be either taken from a store to be put into a lift, or it will be ordered off a catalog. But there's a certain kind of network of work and labor that is implicated in that. The second way would be that you could use a second-hand part. So there are companies like IFE, which we spoke to. We did an interview with Suresh, who is one of the, I think he's one of the sales directors at IFE. IFE keeps a stock of old parts. So old parts that are cannibalized from old lifts that are broken down, and then these parts are they're able to use those again. There's also, I think, in my building, parts keep getting stolen from one of the lifts that is broken down. So I suspect, although I can't be sure, that there's a kind of informal market that also operates within lift parts.
We have 5 more minutes.
Sure, I'll go a little quicker. So these parts, if you're lucky, you can find a second-hand part. Another way is to refurbish, or what Bridget called in our text, MacGyver parts. So somehow to take a part that already exists, change it, fix it, or take the broken part and try and fix it. And there's another kind of set of skill and work, and a different kind of set of relationship to technology that happens with the kind of remaking a part in order to fit into a lift that's now out of date, that's where you can't get new parts for. And the last way in which a part might be gotten is that the part is actually made from scratch, which means that you have to take, you would go to one of these small firms that would produce a single part for you, that they would then take the kind of design or the specs of the part and reproduce it. And this, of course, involves another set of skills, another set of technologies. If you've been to some of these engineering shops, which I have for not so much for lifts, but for other projects, they often have different forms of technology, different sets of skills, different kinds of, so it's not a kind of necessarily an advanced technology, not necessarily a kind of older skill of fitting and turning or something, but they're able to work across different forms of technology, which I think is interesting because also this reflects how the lifts implicate different forms of technology. And so I think this gives us a way to think about how lifts across through both their kind of verticality and their horizontal kind of networks bring together different forms of work. And I think that the ideas of work, and I think something that we're kind of starting to think about, that are kind of questions for the future of this project, is what is the labor of repair? What is the labor of maintenance? How do these forms of work, or how we understand them, allow us to think about different forms of work? So this idea of thinking of work not through the kind of traditional categories of separating certain forms of work from each other, but now to think, but work still is not all exactly the same, but to use different forms of labor, such as repair or maintenance, as a way to think about how to differentiate forms of work from each other. Just quickly, I wanted to mention something about the images and the text descriptions that were playing in the background. And I think one of the interesting things about trying to think about this project is we've been trying to think both in text and visuals of how to represent lifts and how to think about how to represent these aspects of the lifts. And lifts are really difficult to photograph. I mean, particularly from the inside, because there's such a tight space, you never get this overview. And I think there's a way in which you can think about how much of infrastructure is invisible. We don't really see it unless it's broken. So maybe with these old lifts, they become more visible because we're thinking about them more because of our experiences of them. But there's a way in which most of the lift always remains invisible. The engines, the kind of mechanics of the lift are often invisible. We never have a complete picture, but also all these kinds of forms that we're talking about of work, of labor that go into the lift are not all visible in one go. And I think that what we've been trying to do is also think about a kind of visual language or descriptive language that starts to look at the lift through these kind of fragments that speak to and point to the kind of all these kind of multiple intersections that happen in the actual site of the lift. But doing it not through trying to produce an overview of the lift, but through these kind of small parts, through the descriptions, small descriptions of different lifts, to build a kind of image of lifts that I think speaks to its kind of fragmented nature. Okay.
Thank you. We're done.
Thanks very much. Okay, we can move on to Hilton Juden, if you're ready.
Thanks,
Hilton.
Patricia. Yeah, I'm ready. If I can stop sharing, I'll try share now.
Okay.
Okay, Patricia, you can see?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Okay, so thanks very much. I just want to also place it in the context of this larger notion of what I'd set out as community building, although it's not always directly obvious. And raise some of the issues just briefly that came up before, this idea of buildings versus resistance, and two notions of strategic neglect and the politics of the present, which seems to have carried through a lot of the talk. So I just want to raise it in relation to what I'm going to be speaking about now. Political evolution of a building type, and I'm speaking now specifically on the community center under apartheid. In the absence of any broad shared civic space, few white architects recognized the urgency for an architecture to directly address the social neglect and spatial violence of apartheid. For some, it had to be an architecture through which they could work towards a resistance, which I mentioned earlier, an opposition as a response to immediate social crises. These architects imagined building community spaces to meet poignant and unspoken demands that would put the majority of the country on a path to citizenship, proclaimed by civic space, which comes up a lot in many of the talks. The places and buildings that surrounding communities could begin to identify as their own and find a sense of belonging. From the death throes of apartheid and the student uprising in Soweto in June 1976, through to the state of emergency before the transition to democracy, community centers became both urban placeholders and precursors of a society to come. It was a building type at once culturally distinctive, politically imperative, and historically unfamiliar. An examination of this architectural type is followed not only in terms of formal built structures generated in answer to architectural brief, but as a deeper look at social and political demands and lack that had left a space for such a type to evolve, a building type, finding its way into the lexicon and practice of the local in architecture. With the apartheid government unable to face civil unrest or fully address demands around which a resistance had coalesced, the urgent task of providing civic amenities was brought to the forefront by desperate officials and business leaders in forums such as the Urban Foundation in the 1970s. For architects, community centers became a way to participate as more than functionaries in a what could be called a revelatory or revolutionary manner, to offer hopes and a platform for an undivided urbanity that they were looking at. This building type offered a symbolic image of more than a structure of a future of a liberated society in which the state bore responsibility for its citizens. They were looking somewhere in the future. The caring and concern the building expressed offered respite from conditions which were hardly met and at that moment was some way off. A question central to architecture was the architect's responsibility to change society for the better by any means necessary. Were they able to be a force for radical social change, or were there limits that we keep finding in architecture, limits to building processes that were incredibly reliant on the state, compromised social organizations, and naked power? Architects had to grapple with the question of building for a community not of their own, a community from which they had long been set apart. Even as such, solidarity was never insignificant in challenging government and working towards an evolving nationhood. Communities were not homogeneous, they were divided. Their interests did not always align, their needs were not easily articulated, yet community was being understood as something like radical cooperation, of a coming together in a shared political task to overcome differences. Divisions across communities through state-imposed segregation and ethnic enclaves led to a deepening of cultural boundaries and conflicting interests. So these differences had to be overcome, and in the case of architecture, addressed through a building program that drew as much on aspiration and imagination as they would on pragmatism. And in examining the works now, which I'm going to do in this paper, I'm focusing really on 3 architects and 4 buildings. And I'm moving away from the broader discussion that I have in the paper on typologies, a little bit of their background and what they mean to architecture and how they evolved and could be seen in the light of the South African condition. So I'm examining the work of some architects of this transformational period. We see, or begin to see, a shift from the monumental through the symbolic to a social typology of the community center that countered widespread professional aversion to challenging things as they stood, to a complacency and fear in confronting apartheid. And I want to look at the forms architecture took to represent and manifest the ideals of a notion of community divided and beginning to come into being. I want to ask whether there was a way of finding architectural practice in everyday life under apartheid barriers of race and class that more often demanded direct political action. So an important early precursor to building practice is the community center for the small town of Steenkops from 1978 when it was first developed to 80 when the building was more or less finished by the architect Roelof Uyttenbogaard. Here, a remote community in the Northern Cape was offered a shaded respite from the searing climate through a clearly articulated and established expansive civic space in the open landscape. For the architect Uyttenbogaard, apart from the basic program, the purpose as it was described by him or his office at the time, quote, was to celebrate the collective and to add something which would enrich the experience of urbanism. While difficult to articulate by the architect, there was clearly a deeply felt need to go, in his words, beyond the program, to find a communal space sorely lacking in such a landscape. The main linear building mass sat beneath striking concrete stepped linear barrel vaults that allowed harsh light to softly bathe in bare communal hall. Floating steel roof structures glided past simple brick stepped wall planes in an asymmetrical, elongated plan that seemed to sail through the barren landscape. The cluster of buildings that together made up the center surrounded a flowing open space, arrangements and forms clearly derived from his apprenticeship at the University of Pennsylvania under the architect Louis Kahn in the early 60s, and it was true to that monumental typology. This search by Aiton Bogard for a shaded protected hall might have been voiced in terms of more than the bare terrain towards the stark social divisions and deprivation prevalent in rural communities across the country at the time. And as he explained, the whole expresses a shaded world accommodating some of people's simple needs. Here's a building and its various configurations that were intended for all the activities and the current state of the building. Equally important, or embedded as it was in the larger urban plan for the area, was his Aiton Bogard's minor community hall from 1984 in the Cape Flats Township, Belhar, designated for a Black community forcibly removed under apartheid. Set within the pinwheel crossroads of the urban plan done by Aiton Bogard in his office, the public square in which the recreational center, as it was termed, stood, served to anchor a network of public spaces and streets out of which a neighborhood was intended to be carved. For the architect, the, quote, continuity of the urban fabric, he said, was emphasized in a series of sketches, which can be found in his archives, the hall within its context. He diagrams the importance of wall as a container and the gatehouse announcing the axes and entrance, with the continuity of aesthetics and form, as he describes it, materials and colors, all derived from a simple masonry construction and decoration. The multi-purpose hall sat behind an expressive columned loggia and row of service spaces, an unfortunate replication of the colonial stoep or veranda, although here it was seen by them as serving as a cross street of some kind for morning market, soup kitchen, and jumble sale. Symmetry, geometry, abstract order were all brought to a simple structure of concrete blocks and bent corrugated metal sheeting. The buildings for the architect would serve to define and protect the multifunctional tree-covered public space or public realm of the empty, sandy, and desolate flatlands for which it was designated. It is not certain how deeply the community was able to convey to the architects its needs beyond the program or the programmatic, even within the Belhar Group housing project that had been set up, firmly established in the early part of the process. The architects, however, stated that the project had confirmed for them the importance to community of an architecture that is obviously civic and public, by simple means being able to achieve diversity of space and adaptability of use, a many-placedness within the whole, as they describe it, that is possible to achieve a dimension of radiance in a minimal situation. Most importantly, the popular recognition of these qualities by ordinary people of a community. Despite consultation with the community and what was seen as a model participatory process at the time, over housing in particular, there followed widespread disappointment in the semi-detached housing units and its construction, and the social violence that continued to grow in the following decades. I want to move on to Soweto now and the architectural form versus social functionality. Here the church was a central organizing space or group for opposition to meet political challenges from the government, channeling funds often needed for development and providing a moral force to a community's right to the city. For architects, such a building served as a point of reference to the community. Working within society and on the fringes of the state, the church offered architects one of a few channels through which to operate that was legitimate in communities. Completed in 1984, the St. Paul Anglican Church at Jabavu, or White City in Soweto, by Joe Nero, claimed such a political space for social services and communal life through which the church service was organized. Designed by the architect around a courtyard of the existing Ipelageng Community Center and constructed with funds from the Lutheran Church following the 1976 student uprising, this building was inspired by the family of Hector Peterson, who were members of the congregation. St. Paul's was central to a wide community and had become a place for people to meet with the leadership of Soweto. The church and community center were used by church, political, activist groups and unions. Circular in plan with a centralized altar, the church was set up to conduct services in the 3 quadrants in 3 languages. The building was linked through a 4th quadrant to an exterior altar as a communal interface for large services of all kinds for up to 3,000 people in the public courtyard, including for political rallies and meetings with the ANC leadership. For Nero, who was commissioned as a young architect to enlarge the original church by the Archdeacon of Soweto, David Nekwe, churches had long served as symbols of hope, offering help and guidance as such. And to quote, the church building was itself seen to symbolize the struggles by Black people to assert themselves as full citizens of South Africa, which is, with its large scale, solid brick bands and singular circular form, St. Paul's was a highly visible symbol and openly embracing of a community across a public square that had become a focus or civic focus to the neighborhood. While still caught up in the remnants of European postmodernism with decorative brick bands, large round columns, and a triangular pediment, the building equally challenged the fragmented status quo of the surrounding bleak, nondescript township landscape as a symbolic structure where it was long denied. Nero saw the church as providing an urban monumental scale to an important intersection in Soweto through the 12-meter high drum and 4 large round columns, while at the same time providing smaller social scale to the courtyard. Largely built by a local contractor with the priest purchasing materials and the architect supervising, its self-built construction was a point of pride. Within the church, a large ring beam topped by a square roof light bound the congregation intimately in facing towards the altar as a stage. As much as the space served faith, it would uplift communities as a social center central to governmental opposition. Symbolic typology had become one with its task. To Nero, it was always more than a church site, but was a genuine center for local people to meet and interact. And as he said, ultimately to play a role in being a place where people from different walks of life who were sympathetic to the aims of the ANC could meet and talk about the future. I want to end with a small discussion on emancipatory, then social practice. What if the legacy...
5 more minutes.
Okay, what if the legacy is not the building type, but the practice in generating type? The reason for bringing together practitioners in spatial engagements that were necessary to the evolution of community centers. Community building could mean more than the physical structure, broad enough to encompass society and professional agencies required to elaborate space in a divided urban environment where planning had for centuries been utilized for underdevelopment. For the architect Karen Smuts, such challenges remain central to her early architectural practice, where the process of developing a community center coalesced as much around the process of construction techniques and social development by which communities themselves could grow. Through participatory processes, she sought to expand the sense of empowerment and deeper sustainability through which such projects survive. Her practice explains, each project demands its own activities. Interactive processes are a powerful tool in any design phase, as it allows everyone to have a say and often leads to spatial solutions. By listening to people, the architect is provided with a wealth of information to feed into the design process. In a project such as this here, Esther Trekki's First Step Community Center in Komagast in the Makwaland, back now again in the Northern Cape, 1986 to 1990, both a lengthy process of negotiations with delegates from local community and adherence to interpretations of a local vernacular allowed for the architect to place a building in a much deeper context. CS Studio talk about the importance of vernacular architecture and urban informal settlements to their practice. They say a traditional village is made up of a number of structures which are spaced apart, with most of the social interactive spaces being outside. The structures are also placed within doors facing east to bring in the morning sunlight. So it is a perfect system of natural materials, natural use of light, and thermally appropriate. So the building here begins to anchor, protect, and sustain a community challenged by the divisiveness of apartheid. Materials often regarded as degraded or basic were worked carefully by the architects into the scheme of things. The seemingly banal everyday objects and materials are object trouvé. In brick and corrugation, the building detritus of life and use were placed in the forefront as much more than scenic backdrop and props to what was regarded as social theatre. We become aware of who built it and who used it. The use of these intermediate social spaces was central to the construction of public spaces and the usefulness of the in-between spaces derived from the juxtaposition of a smaller programmatic unit. Within this bricolage, functionality is pulled apart to allow individual architectural elements and features of a very ordinary hall to take on the expression of its manifold activities and social arrangements. So I'm going to end now just with a description of what I call a topology of dissonance, what for a short period served to take up the challenge brought to it by socially engaged professionals. White architects as social activists can also be understood as an interregnum in the more rapid deployment of the state-built responses that would eventually stand in place of the civic. For some architects, this was a desperate attempt to find a civic heart to townships left by decades of government control and neglect without care and concern that the public would need to survive in the city. In this shift from the monumental through the symbolic to the social topology, it was as if the latter had already been enveloped within earlier forms, only for it to be drawn out over time. For in some ways, all these buildings were a realization of a community identity fostered through public participation. Equally, there was over time a shifting emphasis in building from governmental contracts to greater reliance on self-build. A topology of dissonance had ensued, reflective of the schism between good intentions and a sharply contested reality, split between healing social functions and emboldened political confrontations. In the end, it was neither buildings nor architects' imagined communal gestures that would see this challenge as more than a gesture to a long and painful struggle against apartheid. Yet the ambition and symbolism of public emancipation was embedded in such tasks. In South Africa, shared civic building did not come about as many had expected, but somehow a public was imagined, or a public space had begun to be thought through. From the periphery to still largely failing centers, civic buildings remain largely unbuilt, and architecture still struggling to take on a public role equally and with care, leaving those a generation after apartheid with a greater sense of belonging in terms of abstract rights and opportunities than as makers of their environment. Thanks, Patricia.
Well, thank you very much, Hilton. Okay, so I see that there are a number of questions that have been sent through in the chat, and I'll try to group these according to participant. We have just under 40 minutes, and I'm going to start off with Simon and Bridget, I think. And I see that there's a couple of questions for you. There's one from Temba Middleman. Temba, would you like to vocalize your question, or would you like me to read it on your behalf?
I was struggling to articulate it, so if you don't mind reading it, I'll appreciate.
All right, that's fine. So I'll read yours, and I see that there's another question also for Bridget and Simon, and I have a question of my own. So I'll just give you all of those so you have a chance to think through and respond. Okay, so Temba says, very interesting presentation. Thank you. I'm curious to hear more about how you see your framing of lifts as intimate public space, manifesting in a social sense. The lens on the history of labor protection and race was compelling, and the anecdote of the women working as an informal trader was interesting. Though the images and a lot of the presentation were more evocative of the materiality and technology of the lifts, conceptually framed with different ideas of work. Can you say more about the publics that use these public spaces? Or what about the technology of the lift as an in-between space, producing a public social space that is different to a stairwell, a pavement, or a bus? Okay, and then there is another question for you, Bridget and Simon. Very inspiring work, especially the focus on labor of repair. have you done interviews with the mechanics fixing lifts? Is there a particular work ethic pressure felt as mistakes can have dramatic consequences, similar to car mechanics who know exactly that some mistakes can have fatal consequences? All right, and then I have a question of my own, and that is, how might this relationship of vertical navigation in the city and the multiple geographies and horizontal trajectories via the circulation of bodies and components be mirrored and mapped onto the substructure or urban underlayer represented by Johannesburg's mining infrastructures, where lifts go down into the depths, a hidden landscape which funded the superstructure? Over to you.
Do you want to start?
I can start with the concept of intimate publics as well. Those are all great questions. So first of all, I think the way I use intimate publics follows Lauren Berlant. And what I'm interested in is the kind of affective spaces that are generated in these ordinary places, right? So that's why I look at department stores. But where what I'm interested in is thinking through the affect in these spaces is also articulated with forms of labor. So if labor, not just people are infrastructure, but labor is infrastructure, the labor of people instantiates, materializes the relationality of these places and this physical space. A lift, I think, is an interesting space because it's, well, for me, it was the department store, and then it took it even more intimately, right? So they're quite specific moments that I could talk about. For instance, the very idea of the job reservation was the job reservation was implemented for passenger lifts. Passenger lifts were separated from goods lifts. Passenger lifts were defined tautologically as those who were occupied by white passengers, whereas good lifts were carrying goods and black passengers. So that the very sort of separation of those spaces already, gives you a sense of the sociality of them. The initial call for the original job reservation, which was not yet in fact implemented in labor law yet, was made not by a worker, not by a union, as we often think of the way job reservation was used as a piece of regulation, but was made by a member of the public, a husband who was very unhappy that his wife was riding up in was called the Medical Center building in Pretoria Street in Pretoria in 1955, and he asked the Minister of Labor if he could, because the lift doors open and there was a black lift operator, and he didn't want his wife riding up in a lift with a black lift operator, black man, male lift operator. So the affect of those spaces, are and precisely is who is riding in there, but then also what are the ways these are becoming discussed and talked about. I think for me, what I'm interested in is how those stories offer us a view to the historical present. And this is also true later on when as the debates around the job reservation continue, as when by the late 50s, early 60s, the city is shifting and all sorts of people are using lifts. They're going to visit their lawyers, to visit their doctors, and even as there are segregated lifts, people are jumbling around together, and it's becoming an issue, and it's becoming a point of public discussion. So, I mean, I think for me, it's just a particularly emotive site to really think through it. I think buses are very similar. For me, a bus is another kind of space. A department store is another space for me. Again, another way to think concretely about the sociality of those spaces is, the white women lift operators. I've interviewed a number of women who worked in department stores between the 1930s, in fact, and the 1970s, including one lift operator. It was really hard to find lift operators, but she, in fact, Linda, interestingly, she was a working class white Afrikaans woman who got her first job in Woolworths and operating a lift, and she loved the job. She loved operating the technology. And one of the things she spoke about was how it was often her with the other workers in the department store, other women workers, riding up and down the lifts. And the job quite famously called for you to call out what was on every floor. So you would perform what was on every floor as the doors were opening and people could move in and out. But sorry, Linda, interestingly, she then left this job to enter teachers training, a teachers training college in the 1960s. And achieved class mobility, and she understood it as such. So I think there's quite concrete ways to talk about it, and that's how I would write about it. That's how I'm writing about it, is to find these quite specific sites of who is up, who is there, and what are the engagements. I mean, there are other spaces. I think the lobby of lifts, I mean, is another space to think about as people are waiting for lifts, or people are discussing whether or not the lift is broken down or isn't broken down, and should they be taking the stairs or not. Those kinds of spaces. But I think that's how I sort of respond to it, Timba. So thanks for that question.
I just wanted to add a little bit there that I think is important. And so, I mean, obviously lifts serve a lot of different publics, but I think that there's something interesting, I think particularly given the theme of this conference around these kinds of ruins and these old lifts that allow for a certain kind of living and working, or make possible. And if you have an old lift, I mean, obviously the easiest thing to do would be to replace the lift, but obviously that comes at a certain expense, and it changes like the rent, or it changes the expense of the building. And then it becomes a different group of people are able to access that. Obviously in a high-rise building, if a lift breaks down completely, it becomes inaccessible to a large group of people. So what these lifts do, and I mean, these lifts really do break down all the time. There's really a different kind of labor that is constantly trying to fix them, where when you fix it, you don't know whether the fix will work for an hour, whether it'll work for a day, whether it'll work for 3 months. You fix this, maybe something else breaks, maybe the same part breaks. I mean, I think that this kind of unpredictability and uncertainty in the kind of labor of this repair and this continuous labor allows for certain groups of people, or certain communities, I mean communities in very, very loose sense, to live and work in these spaces, and that these lifts allow for certain kinds of living and certain kinds of, and this is not to like say that it's necessarily good or to romanticize it, but I mean, it's a super precarious thing. And maybe to the later question, these lifts can be dangerous, mostly not because they're going to fall, but they do break down, people get stuck in it. They are rarely precarious spaces, and they're also very frustrating, and they're also very difficult to live with or to work with, but they do allow for a different way of living, I guess, or for different kinds of access in terms of who is the public that uses them.
I mean, I can just quickly respond to the great question about lift repairmen and mechanics. That's exactly what our project is looking at. We've been slowed down quite a bit by COVID, but we have begun by interviewing one former lift repairman who was very aware of that, and as he moved into kind of management and became a director of the company that we visited, and a number of the images are from their storeroom, so that gives you a sense of how they stock these spare parts in case they need them in their variety of kinds of lifts that they maintain. He's the idea of the skill of repair is really critical. The idea of course, the range of regulations covering lifts, how it gets regulated by the Department of Labor, by the Department of Health, and kind of meeting those standards is very critical. But we've just really spoken to him thus far, but that's exactly the kinds of things that we're interested in examining. And then very quickly, mining, the mining cage, absolutely. So my larger work lifts, as I was suggesting, is looking at kind of a range of different ways of getting at lifts as a kind of object, as a site of what it can tell us. You know, it's the kind of obvious complement to the elevation is the mining cage that goes down. And of course it, you know, a range of the symbolisms are not there, which is very interesting. And of course, the lift itself, initially, all that technology was imported. So Otis and Schindler were the key companies importing lifts, and they would import the whole, you know, the majority of that technology would initially be imported. But of course, the mining cage is, you know, is as a feature of our own engineering industry. And so the mining cage without the, you know, has no interior. It's a cage. It goes down, you know, the kind of safety features are quite different. And I think that as the shadow, or, you know, Mbembe talks about, you know, the mine workers as the kind of subconscious to the you know, to the surface of the city, I think is absolutely critical to be able to connect to it. Yeah. Do you want to add anything about the images?
I mean, maybe just, yeah, to say with the I mean, the images, I think one with the kind of way in which they speak more to the materiality than the publics is because I think that's where we were really starting with the lift as an object, as a site, and really trying to think from there. But also it is an ongoing project, and then it's something that I think we're going to be thinking more about, is how to also speak to the publics. But I think it really, starting from the object of the lift, or the site of the lift, as this kind of beginning point, as an actual thing that requires actual labor, I think is sort of where we've begun to think about the imaging of lifts.
Thank you very much. I'm going to just quickly read the comment by Lawrence Stewart, which is also on your work. Just before we move on to some questions for Hilton, just a comment on the presentation of Bridget and Simon. I think it is fascinating how both vertical and horizontal planes are represented. I like the way the continuity in space through where people live, the labor relationships, parts of the lifts, the repair of the lifts, indicate the lift as the network through which the horizontal and vertical planes are inextricably linked, similar to Lefebvre's theory of the interconnected nature of space. Interesting and thought-provoking. So thank you both very much. Hilton, there's a question for you from Johan Swart, and I have a question of my own. Did you draw some of the Eytan Burkhardt drawings from the UCT archives? Okay, all right. And then I wanted to pick up on some of the things you said. You made reference to an imagined society where the activist architect working in the 80s and 90s in South Africa was tasked with first imagining and then creating communities through the design typology of the community center.
Well, they saw themselves as doing that rather than literally tasked, yeah.
Right. So this is a consequence of the politics and the fact that there was limited to no public or civic architecture for the majority of South Africans. The projects you mentioned are built in good faith. They adopt strategies for a civic and public architecture. You mentioned continuity of neighborhood, the technology, the aspect of social development. To what extent is the imagination of community a successful enabler of these projects, or were there limitations? And does this in any way resonate with the task of the architect during the pandemic, who's once again often imagining the public and the quotidian experience?
Okay, so first quickly with Johan from UP, yes, we did, well, I had somebody help me with retrieving Eytan Burkhardt's drawings, and we did have them out in the hall a week before the fire, and I understand they were returned. So I'm not sure of their current condition and whether any of them had unfortunately remained behind or were damaged, but I'm busy trying to find that out. But yeah, they've got some way to go before they can identify the extent of the damage. And it's a reminder for me of, yeah, kind of our task in where we keep or get or access all this information. Eytan Burkhardt is one of the few extensive architectural, as you know, repositories of an architect's life work. So a lot can be done with that. We don't have such luxury with a lot of other architects. And then I note also that I'm working with two living architects, obviously, Joan Era and Karen Smuts, who have within their office an extensive archive. And yeah, I anticipate at some point that they will also be preserving them somewhere, and how important that is. And that's part of the urgency I felt with suddenly moving away from the 60s and starting to work now in something of more my contemporary time, which is into the 70s and 80s. The urgency to do that now and start doing what I never did before and record and meet architects from the earlier period, because we have no record of that. In terms of what you're saying, I think the participatory process, yeah, became the essential one to define this relationship with the community, to begin to try retrieve or work with the community in imagining something else. And from what I tried to show is from the early period of just tentatively working on it through the mid 80s, where it became much more active part of the process. I think architects began to find a way to draw in and draw on a community in imagining or bringing about a building imagined, or something that hadn't been imagined before, and how essential it was for them to do it. If I stretch outside of South Africa, Ian Louw's work in Lesotho in that period would also become really important in drawing building material, building a community through building. And we know how essential it is to practice currently. We also know the difficulties of it, and we know when we work with a broader community or more generalized community, in other words, when you start to talk about the civic, of it becoming impossible, or even in large-scale neighborhoods, when you're talking about, you know, hundreds or thousands of people, the sheer impossibility of it, and then having to draw on what becomes an organized or functional component of the larger community, the sheer difficulty of doing that. Many architects continue to grapple with it. And what I was interested in the building is this movement away from a strict built form to something that starts to engage more deeply with broader shared social processes as a function of the architect. And in the paper, I look much more extensively internationally. I don't have time to go into that, and that becomes more important. And we see it coming again in the last decade, and it's accelerating really in the last year, as you say, with the pandemic, when we have been incredibly divided and struck by the pandemic in really different ways. A recognition of a lot of not only labor, sociality behind these differences, but also space. And our movement through the city has been one that really became a life-threatening one. I think that's of enormous significance. So not only a matter, building not only a matter of comfort and containment, but also of life, literal life. And I think that's probably what's going to bring greater emphasis now again on engaging with different communities around the world. Just 2 points with the earlier talk on lifts. Simon would be aware of, yeah, and I think the connection to the mining was really interesting, but it's more than the cage. I thought it's a steel cable that's of enormous significance. And it always struck me when I was doing a lot of research in the early 80s, is that enormous industry, really the basis of Joburg's manufacturing industry, really began and revolved around that steel cable, and the limits or moving past the limits of that steel cable, that lift connection going eventually kilometers into the ground, is also a fascinating spatial one. And then the last thing was Simon talked about being rescued by the staircase when the lifts don't work, and how many people are. So as a parallel to the lift and what it provides, it's a reminder of the staircase, the ordinary staircase, and what it allows when all this other stuff breaks down. So, and I just want to, whilst I just got the floor, is just raise with Ali, when we have talked in the past about it, but it came up again, this idea of showing resistance. You talked about it through the photography, or of not showing resistance. of mute or inert photographs or mute or inert buildings, and the ability of, in the case of coal black photograph or what we're talking about buildings, the ability, whether there is or how we find resistance in buildings. Maybe at some point, Ali can comment on that. Thanks, Patricia.
Thank you, Hilton. I see there's a question for both you and Linda from Hannah. So I'd like to read that, and maybe I could just go through the questions for Linda, and then you might start, Hilton, and then pass over to Linda. So Hannah's question is to both of you. Is it possible to consider these institutional buildings as heterotopic in their capacity to house meetings of resistance communities, both in running them and in the gathering spaces? And then there was another question. I'll just go through the questions for Linda. The political role of teacher education colleges was extremely important within a civilizing mission of coloniality. What about now? Does teacher education have a similarly remarkable political role in the process of rebuilding the nation and liberating its cultural life? Is there enough awareness of its importance? All right, and then I've got a question for Linda as well, and then maybe Hilton, you can start. I was just interested by the kind of comparison between the first presentation by Ali with the case of Vita's page view, where we were looking at an environment that had been erased, written over, with new layers inscribed. And then the teaching training colleges existing in part as remnants of a former time. So in this sense, we have the buildings and the associated landscapes as witnesses of colonial influence, of apartheid social engineering, and yet there's also evidence of this existence of a counter narrative that you mentioned. You mentioned the association and nostalgia for the social rather than the physical, of the social production of space by the communities that inhabited them. So I would be interested to know from you, how then do we understand the value of the materiality of these places in relation to the succession of ideas that we project onto them as a society? Hilton, would you like to?
Okay, so briefly, thanks very much, Hannah. And I did raise it again about this notion of resistance, where you find it in inert things like buildings and photographs, and also a larger cultural field. But in buildings in particular, it's exactly where you point out. It's finally how these buildings function, to hold meetings, to gather people. And Nero talks about that in terms of his building. It's been really important and he goes into that quite extensively. And I followed up in the larger paper about the meetings that were held there and the gathering space that was there. And even the process of building, how it was sort of done under or behind the scenes in the evenings, where he later goes on to build the dormitories themselves without government officials being aware. And we know famously all the buildings that became hideouts and important places for exactly what you say. So centers of resistance. And I think the community centers I show, whilst not always resistance in the most obvious political terms, they definitely were sites of communal gathering, not only in opposition to government but as a collective. And that's the life of the building. And that maybe raises the question about the difficulties then they underwent in the 90s, with some of them being directly targeted by factions of different groups, by the government themselves in some cases. And that's another whole question where there was an awareness just of the extent to which these were happening. But of course, clandestinely, most of those gatherings really happened in people's houses. And that's another whole interesting space to examine when we look at historically the role of buildings or architecture in the largest resistance that group. I'll hand over to, I think it's Linda. She wants to pick up on that and maybe the other questions. Thank you.
Yes, okay, let's begin with Itala's question. about the civilizing role of coloniality and whether there's a similarly political role. I think, you know, you can look at the political intentions of rulers on the one hand, but I don't think, you know, are that important, because the intentions are really rarely met by the outcomes. So I think what we need to look at is how the institutions themselves produce identity. Now, in the that will also tie up with the subsequent question. So clearly, in the apartheid period, institutions were constructed around race and ethnicity, and so built racialized identities, gendered identities, and so on, around being white, Indian, colored, African, and a range of different ethnicities. And I think part of what the shift towards universities achieved was to dissolve that particular space of identity formation into different institutions with different historical identities, which shape teacher identities in a particular way. They're now part of universities, so they're either part of WITS or UCT or Northwest University or Limpopo. These each have historical identities which become part of the process of forming new teacher identities. I think that what's also important is that, I mean, obviously within all the educational literature, the formation of a South African nation is important. But that always has to be counterbalanced against how the construction of the nation produces the other. And you've got to see that in the context of the xenophobia in South Africa and so on. So while there is clearly a broader role of building the South African nation rather than specific ethnic groups, I don't think we must forget the particular institutional histories and their roles, and also the way in which the construct of nation itself continues to produce others. In terms of the question about resistances, I did a number of interviews that were very telling and very interesting, particularly in the 60s and 70s, with a range of people in what were then colored Indian and African institutions. And they all described or spoke about both extremely repressive institutions, conservative curricula that they absolutely hated, but also that these were places and spaces where they formed and forged their political identities, and if not a political identity, then a sporting identity or some other kind of identity. So they were, for a very brief period of time, home. And in that space of home, for many students, they had a powerful impact also in shaping different kinds of identities. Resistance identities amongst them, but not the only one. Teacher associations and teacher unions obviously also play a role in that, and they have strengthened post-apartheid. Identities of resistance and these institutions as spaces for resistance. We're very aware of that during the 1980s and the 1970s, even before, but in the post-apartheid period, it's clearly continued, and that also continues to shape the new identity of the new teacher. This does not mean that racialized and ethnic identities have disappeared, but that they're being reconfigured in different ways in these new institutions where they're being thought differently with new repertoires of resistance and theory informing the practices of teachers. I think I've answered the questions.
Thank you very much. I'm just cognizant of time, and we've not yet heard from Ali. Ali, did you get a chance to take note of Hilton's question?
Yes, yes.
Okay. And then I have a question for you as well, which you can address afterwards. It was just that, could you comment on the method of reading history that you employed? What did the deconstruction of the photographic archive with photographs as stories, somewhat curated through cropping, framing, choice of color, reveal about the power asymmetries inscribed in these depictions of everyday life in fetus page view? And how might these readings open up speculative imaginings and interpretations for possible reconstruction and social reparation? What tools do they provide us with for re-envisaging a future?
Thank you. I would like to start first with just Hilton's comment about the place of resistance in community centers. Incidentally, in the 1980s, I was associated myself with a community center in Soweto known as Funda Center. And there are two observations I make with relation to these centers and resistance. First is the timing. The period 1977 to the 1980s, marks a transition from student protests to what has been widely defined as insurrection in the 1980s. And therefore, you would then have an intervention in the context of Funda Center from big business led by the Urban Foundation to try and the understanding is that it was to dampen the militant mood by creating these centers as alternative spaces for self-expression. However, a new form of intellectual resistance emerged from these centers, and it is the type of resistance that Linda also notes with regards to the functionality of the colleges of education, in a way reversing what their founders intended, but becoming the opposite of what they intended. And the centers so resistance took ideological forms like exploring ideas of alternative education, either in the arts, a new movement of adult education in the context of Funda Center, so that whilst big business created the infrastructure as bricks and mortar, but they were not able to insert overtly an ideology that was then accepted given the political mood of the time, and therefore resistance continued. These sites are remembered today as important platforms where many, in the context of Funda Center, artists who played a meaningful role in using art as a tool of struggle emerged in the 80s. And then on the question of the history of fictas, what I'm attempting to do is to explore the theory of the everyday, but I'm not going to the theoreticians like Lefebvre and others. I am going back to literature by writers like S.K. Mphahlele, Njabulo Ndebele, and even poetry by Sipho Spamla, who wrote and also experienced forced removals, but they tell the stories of forced removals, exploring the experiences of what the notion of the everyday would see as the mundane. What did the forced removals mean to a child who left home, went to school, excited to go and see the friends, came back home to find that the bulldozer had visited the home and the home is no longer there? What did it mean, for a washerwoman who, as he was carrying the bundle of washing as depicted in Sipho Spamla's poetry, left also home to do his work and only to return home and find that she no longer have a house? And I'm juxtaposing that with the articulated views by the photographer here, who argued that he deliberately kept away from public activities. And I think here he meant really protests, because he saw those as once-off activities, is something that, of course, I do not completely share, because I think protest takes different form and has different continuities. But I attempt to say, does the everyday, as emerging in these photographs of the mundane, help us understand deeper the historic experiences of forced removals, or do they demean the tragedy behind the experiences of a man just sitting behind a building that has partly collapsed and is still partly in space? You know, what better reading can, and also what I'm also attempting to explore, why is it that the curatorial hand tries to shy away from that aspect of the auditorial and go for the spectacular? Thanks, I'll end there.
Thank you very much. And thank you to all our participants and guests for a rich and varied discussion. This brings our session to a close. The next session will begin at 11:15. I think it's over to Pam. We're going to take a short break. We'll be back if you need to communicate anything.